when a routine daytime TV interview suddenly takes a sharp turn, leaving the hosts and audience visibly stunned. What happens when a routine conversation on live television takes an unexpected turn? Make sure to subscribe to Prime Voice and like and comment for more real talk show coverage. The segment began the way many daytime interviews do. The hosts were seated at the table, the audience had just settled after a commercial break, and the mood in the studio felt light but attentive. Rami Malek had joined the panel to promote his latest project, and the initial exchange was relaxed. There was polite applause as he walked out, a brief greeting, and a few opening remarks about his recent work and the experience of preparing for the role. The tone was professional and calm, with the hosts offering supportive commentary and a few light questions to warm up the discussion. Whoopi Goldberg, as moderator, guided the early part of the conversation. She asked about the emotional preparation required for the project and whether Malek felt public expectations had shifted since his earlier career milestones. Malek responded thoughtfully, speaking in his measured way, often pausing slightly before answering. His body language suggested comfort, but also careful consideration. He leaned slightly forward when speaking, hands loosely folded, maintaining steady eye contact with the panel. As the conversation progressed, the discussion shifted toward the broader social themes connected to his new role. The project reportedly dealt with political tensions and questions of public trust, which naturally opened the door to commentary about current events. One of the co-hosts mentioned how audiences today are more sensitive to portrayals of power and authority, and that led to a general conversation about accountability in public life. It was at this point that the tone began to subtly change. Whoopi introduced a question that connected the themes of the film to real-world controversies. She framed it as a cultural observation, asking whether actors who take on politically charged roles have a responsibility to speak publicly about the issues reflected in their work. Her tone was calm, but the question was pointed. It implied that silence can sometimes be interpreted as avoidance. Malek listened without interrupting. He nodded once as she finished speaking, then took a moment before answering. He began by saying that he believes in being informed before speaking out. He emphasized that while actors can use their platforms responsibly, they are not policy experts. His delivery was steady, but there was a noticeable seriousness in his expression. He seemed intent on clarifying his position carefully. Whoopi responded by gently pressing further. She suggested that public figures often benefit from the visibility that comes with fame and that audiences sometimes expect them to engage directly with pressing issues. Her tone was not confrontational, but it was firmer than before. The studio audience grew quieter, sensing that the conversation had shifted from promotion into something more substantial. Malek adjusted in his chair and replied that while he understands public expectations, he is cautious about being drawn into debates that oversimplify complex problems. He explained that his work as an actor allows him to explore perspectives through storytelling rather than through direct commentary. As he spoke, his pace slowed slightly, and he chose his words with precision. Another co-host briefly interjected, suggesting that even acknowledging an issue publicly can carry weight. That comment prompted a small ripple of applause from a section of the audience. It was polite, not overwhelming, but enough to register. Malek glanced toward the audience for a moment before returning his focus to the table. Whoopi then made a remark that appeared to strike more directly at the heart of the disagreement. She said that silence, in certain moments in history, has been viewed as complicity. She clarified that she wasn't accusing him personally, but she framed it as a broader cultural truth. The phrasing was careful, yet it carried an unmistakable weight. The atmosphere in the studio grew noticeably more serious. Malek responded by saying he disagreed with the idea that silence automatically equates to agreement. He explained that reflection and listening can also be forms of engagement. As he said this, his tone remained calm, but there was a firmness underneath it. His posture straightened slightly, and his hands, which had been loosely clasped, began to gesture more deliberately as he spoke. Whoopi listened without interruption, but her expression was focused. When he finished, she asked whether public figures have a heightened responsibility precisely because of their influence. The exchange remained respectful, yet the rhythm of the conversation had clearly shifted from conversational to deliberate. What stood out in this moment was not raised voices or overt hostility, but the subtle tension that can arise when two people hold fundamentally different views on responsibility and public engagement. The audience seemed attentive, almost still, as if aware that the discussion had crossed into sensitive territory. Malek clarified that he does speak on issues that matter to him, but prefers to do so in thoughtful ways rather than reacting in the heat of public pressure. He mentioned that the current media environment often demands immediate responses, which can oversimplify nuanced topics. His words were measured, but the repetition of phrases like careful consideration and responsible dialogue suggested he felt strongly about the distinction. Whoopi responded by saying that sometimes waiting too long to speak can mean missing the moment when voices are most needed. She emphasized that she respects differing approaches, but believes that platforms come with obligations. The way she phrased it was deliberate, and there was a slight pause after she finished, as if allowing the weight of her point to settle. The tension at the table was visible, though controlled. The co-hosts remained attentive, with one offering a brief nod to Malek and another glancing toward Whoopi, as if anticipating the next question. The audience, which had been quietly following along, remained silent. Malek then addressed Whoopi directly, saying that he appreciates her perspective, but believes there is room for multiple forms of engagement. He explained that activism can take many shapes and that storytelling itself can shift public consciousness. His tone was respectful but unmistakably firm, signaling that this was not simply a promotional conversation anymore. As the segment moved forward, it became clear that the disagreement was less about any single issue and more about philosophy, about how public figures navigate expectation, influence, and responsibility. The exchange remained composed, but the energy in the room had changed. What began as a routine interview had evolved into a thoughtful and at times tense debate about accountability in public life. By the time the first portion of the discussion neared its midpoint, the audience could sense that the conversation had taken on a life of its own. The promotional aspects of the segment were now secondary to the broader cultural question unfolding at the table. And while no one raised their voice, the seriousness of the moment was unmistakable, setting the stage for an even deeper exchange as the segment continued. As the discussion continued, the atmosphere at the table remained composed, but the tone was undeniably more serious than when the segment began. The shift had happened gradually, almost imperceptibly, yet everyone in the studio seemed aware that the conversation was no longer simply about a film release. It had evolved into a broader exchange about public responsibility, influence, and timing. Whoopi Goldberg did not raise her voice or alter her posture dramatically, but her questions became more direct. She leaned slightly forward and asked Rami Malek whether he felt that audiences sometimes interpret careful neutrality as distance. The phrasing was deliberate. It wasn't accusatory, but it was pointed enough to require a clear answer. Malek paused again before responding. He clasped his hands together on the table and acknowledged that perception can be powerful. He said that he understands why some viewers might want immediate statements from public figures, especially in moments of national tension. However, he reiterated that he believes depth matters more than speed. His tone remained calm, though the firmness in his delivery suggested he felt the need to clarify his stance more strongly. One of the co-hosts interjected gently, noting that daytime talk shows often serve as platforms for real-time reactions. She explained that viewers at home sometimes look to the table for guidance or affirmation during challenging moments. That comment drew a small murmur of agreement from the studio audience. Malek responded by saying that he respects that role, but doesn't see himself as a commentator in the traditional sense. He explained that his training and focus are rooted in character work, empathy, and storytelling. He said that he prefers to contribute to conversations through art rather than through rapid commentary cycles. At this point, the pacing of the exchange slowed. The conversation was no longer quick back and forth. Each participant seemed to weigh their words more carefully. Whoopi nodded as he spoke, but followed up by saying that sometimes art and commentary intersect whether an artist intends it or not. She referenced how certain performances can become symbols in broader cultural debates. The studio audience remained attentive, with occasional scattered applause when a point resonated. There were no interruptions from the control room, no commercial breaks cutting in to diffuse the moment. The discussion was allowed to unfold naturally, which gave it a sense of authenticity. Malek acknowledged that art can become symbolic, but maintained that he resists being placed into roles he hasn't chosen for himself. He explained that he wants to avoid being boxed into a position where every silence is interpreted as a statement. His voice remained steady, but his gestures became slightly more animated. He opened his hands outward while speaking, as if emphasizing the complexity of the situation. Whoopi responded with a measured counterpoint. She said that public visibility changes the equation. She explained that with influence comes scrutiny, and with scrutiny often comes expectation. She clarified that she wasn't asking him to comment on any specific policy or event, but rather speaking about the broader principle of engagement. Another co-host stepped in to slightly soften the moment, saying that different personalities approach public life differently. She suggested that some people are naturally outspoken while others are reflective. That comment briefly eased the tension, and there was a faint ripple of laughter from the audience, not because anything was humorous, but because the room seemed to appreciate the attempt to balance the exchange. Malek smiled briefly at that remark, acknowledging the point. However, he then returned to the central issue. He said that he worries about the culture of immediate reaction, where statements are often dissected and amplified without context. He explained that he has seen how quickly conversations can become polarized, especially online. Whoopi listened carefully, and then made an observation about the nature of television itself. She said that live discussion allows for nuance because tone, facial expression, and body language are visible. She suggested that conversations like the one they were having are an example of how disagreement can remain respectful and constructive. There was a noticeable pause after she said that. It seemed to reframe the tension not as conflict, but as dialogue. The audience responded with modest applause, recognizing the point. Still, the core disagreement had not disappeared. Malek respectfully pushed back by saying that even live television has its limitations. He explained that short segments often cannot capture the full complexity of an issue. He said he prefers long-form conversations where ideas can be explored thoroughly rather than condensed into brief sound bites. The exchange remained composed, but there was now a clear philosophical divide at the table. Whoopi leaned back slightly in her chair and crossed her hands in front of her, signaling that she was considering his perspective. She then asked a more personal question. Had he ever felt pressure to speak publicly when he wasn't ready? That question shifted the tone slightly. It moved from abstract philosophy to personal experience. Malek nodded and admitted that there have been moments when he felt the weight of expectation. He explained that navigating that pressure can be challenging, especially when the public conversation is highly charged. As he described those experiences, his voice softened slightly. The firmness remained, but there was a layer of introspection that hadn't been present earlier. The audience grew even quieter, sensing that he was speaking candidly. Whoopi responded by acknowledging that pressure exists across many professions, including her own. She shared that being in a visible role often means being asked to take positions on complex issues. Her tone carried a sense of understanding rather than challenge. For a brief stretch, the tension eased. The discussion felt more reflective than confrontational. However, the central disagreement resurfaced when another co-host asked whether remaining silent can inadvertently empower louder, more extreme voices. That question brought the conversation back to its core tension. Malek answered by saying that he believes responsibility lies with everyone, not just public figures. He emphasized that civic engagement is not exclusive to celebrities. He explained that focusing too heavily on celebrity commentary can distract from broader participation. The statement drew a mix of reactions from the audience, some nods, some thoughtful expressions. There was no clear majority reaction, which reflected the complexity of the issue. Whoopi gently challenged that idea by saying that visibility magnifies impact. She pointed out that when someone with millions of followers speaks, it reaches farther than the average citizen's voice. Her delivery remained steady, but there was a firmness in her phrasing that underscored her conviction. Malek did not interrupt. He waited until she finished and then reiterated that he values responsibility, but believes it must be exercised authentically. He said that speaking purely to satisfy expectation can undermine credibility. The rhythm of the exchange had now settled into a pattern. Question, thoughtful response, measured counterpoint. There were no raised voices, no abrupt gestures, but the seriousness of the disagreement was clear. It was not about a single headline or controversy. It was about the philosophy of public engagement in a media-driven era. As the segment approached another transition point, the studio energy remained focused. The audience seemed aware that they were witnessing a genuine exchange of ideas rather than a promotional routine. The hosts maintained professionalism, and Malek remained composed. The discussion had grown more layered, more nuanced, and at times quietly tense. And while both sides expressed respect, neither appeared willing to fully concede their position. The stage was set for the conversation to deepen even further as the segment moved toward its next phase. As the segment moved deeper into its third stretch, the conversation no longer felt like a typical promotional stop. The energy at the table was focused and deliberate. No one appeared flustered, but there was a shared understanding that the discussion had become substantive. The studio audience remained unusually quiet for daytime television, listening closely as the exchange continued. Whoopi Goldberg shifted slightly in her seat and reframed the discussion in a broader cultural context. She said that in moments of heightened political or social tension, audiences often look to artists not just for entertainment, but for reassurance or clarity. She emphasized that this expectation is not always fair, but it is real. Her voice was even, measured, and reflective rather than confrontational. Rami Malek listened intently. He maintained steady eye contact and nodded once before responding. He acknowledged that artists have historically played roles in shaping conversations. However, he drew a distinction between art that reflects society and artists being expected to serve as commentators on demand. He explained that when he chooses to speak publicly, he wants it to be rooted in deep understanding, not pressure. One of the co-hosts leaned in at that point and asked whether there is ever a risk that waiting for perfect understanding can result in paralysis. The question was phrased carefully, almost academically, and it shifted the conversation into more analytical territory. A few audience members murmured softly, signaling engagement with the nuance of the discussion. Malek responded that he doesn't believe in waiting for perfection, but he does believe in thoughtful preparation. He spoke about the responsibility of accuracy and the potential harm of misinformation. His tone remained calm, but there was a slight tightening around his expression, suggesting that this was a point he cared deeply about. Whoopi acknowledged that concern, but introduced another angle. She said that sometimes, even expressing empathy without offering detailed analysis can matter. She pointed out that audiences often respond not just to policy positions, but to a sense of shared humanity. As she said this, her hands moved gently to emphasize connection rather than argument. The exchange remained respectful, yet the philosophical gap persisted. Malek agreed that empathy is essential, but he cautioned against performative gestures. He explained that in the current media landscape, statements can quickly become symbolic acts divorced from meaningful follow-through. His delivery was steady, and he avoided emotional escalation, but his words were precise. The camera occasionally cut to the other co-hosts, who appeared attentive and thoughtful. One nodded subtly when Malek referenced the speed of online reactions. Another glanced toward Whoopi, perhaps anticipating her response. The studio audience stayed composed, with no significant applause or interruptions. Whoopi responded by clarifying that she was not advocating for superficial statements. Instead, she suggested that silence can sometimes leave a vacuum that others fill. She emphasized that public figures often have the ability to redirect conversations toward civility or understanding. Her voice remained calm, but her emphasis on the word vacuum underscored her point. Malek paused for several seconds before replying. The silence itself seemed to heighten the seriousness of the moment. He then said that he understands the concern about vacuums, but believes that individuals must decide how they contribute in ways aligned with their values. He stated that he does engage in conversations privately and through charitable work, even if those efforts are not always publicized. That comment shifted the tone slightly. There was a subtle shift in body language around the table. One co-host offered a supportive nod, acknowledging that activism can take many forms. A light round of applause came from a section of the audience, though it was restrained. Whoopi responded with a softer tone, saying that she respects private efforts but also believes that visibility can inspire others to act. She shared an anecdote about how seeing a public figure speak out once encouraged her to take action on an issue she cared about. The story was brief and personal, which momentarily eased the tension. Malek listened and responded by saying he values that perspective. However, he reiterated that authenticity matters more to him than volume. He explained that when he does speak, he wants it to reflect genuine conviction rather than reactionary pressure. His voice remained steady, but there was a firmness that indicated he was not shifting his stance. The audience seemed divided but respectful. There were no audible boos or strong applause. Instead, there was the quiet attentiveness that often accompanies serious discussions on daytime television. The conversation felt less like a debate and more like two seasoned professionals articulating different philosophies about public life. At one point, another co-host attempted to bridge the gap by suggesting that perhaps the disagreement was more about timing than principle. She proposed that both perspectives value responsibility, but differ on how quickly it should be exercised. That comment drew modest applause and seemed to provide a momentary release of tension. Malek acknowledged that timing is part of the issue. He explained that he resists the idea that urgency always equals effectiveness. He said that sustained engagement over time can have more impact than immediate statements. His posture remained upright, and his hands were once again loosely folded, signaling composure. Whoopi responded by noting that some moments in history feel urgent precisely because they are. She did not specify any particular event, keeping the discussion broad. Her tone carried quiet conviction rather than force. She added that people watching at home may be navigating their own confusion and sometimes look for reassurance from familiar voices. The exchange grew slightly more pointed at this stage. Malek addressed her directly, saying he understands that expectation, but believes public figures should not be the sole source of reassurance. He emphasized the importance of community dialogue beyond celebrity platforms. His voice did not rise, but the clarity of his disagreement was unmistakable. For a brief moment, there was a pause at the table. The studio felt still. Then Whoopi nodded and said that disagreement itself can be productive. She remarked that viewers benefit from seeing thoughtful debate rather than uniform agreement. The comment appeared to reframe the tension once more as constructive rather than adversarial. The conversation continued with smaller follow-up questions from the panel, each probing a slightly different angle of the same central issue. Malek remained composed, measured, and deliberate. Whoopi maintained her steady moderation style, occasionally challenging but never interrupting mid-sentence. By the end of this portion of the segment, it was clear that neither side had fully persuaded the other. Yet the discussion had remained grounded and professional throughout. The audience sensed that they were witnessing a genuine exchange of perspectives, rather than a rehearsed talking point. What began as a routine interview had transformed into a layered conversation about influence, authenticity, and responsibility in the modern media landscape. And as the cameras continued rolling, the atmosphere suggested that the dialogue was far from over. As the conversation moved into its fourth stretch, the rhythm at the table felt steady but undeniably serious. The promotional tone that had opened the segment was now almost entirely absent. Instead, the exchange had settled into something more reflective, even philosophical. No one appeared angry, yet the disagreement remained present just beneath the surface. Whoopi Goldberg shifted the discussion slightly by asking whether there is ever a point when staying out of public discourse becomes its own statement. Her tone was calm, but the question carried weight. She wasn't framing it as an accusation. Rather, she presented it as a reality of modern media culture. In an era where silence can be interpreted in multiple ways, she suggested that public figures may not have full control over how their quiet is perceived. Rami Malek listened carefully. He took a longer pause than before, exhaling subtly before responding. He said he understands that interpretation is inevitable, but he emphasized that he cannot shape his decisions solely around how others might speculate. His delivery remained measured. He spoke about personal boundaries and the importance of mental clarity in moments of public pressure. The audience remained attentive. There was no visible restlessness, no whispered chatter. It was the kind of quiet that suggests people are processing what they're hearing rather than waiting for a dramatic moment. One of the co-hosts gently asked whether he worries that declining to comment publicly could unintentionally disappoint fans who look up to him. The question was softer in tone, and it introduced an emotional element that hadn't been explicitly discussed yet. Malek nodded and acknowledged that he does consider his audience. He said he never wants to appear indifferent. However, he explained that he believes his responsibility to his audience includes being honest about his limitations. He added that he does not want to present himself as an authority on subjects outside his expertise, simply because of public expectation. Whoopi responded by saying that honesty about limitations can itself be powerful. She noted that sometimes viewers appreciate transparency about uncertainty. Her comment slightly softened the tension again, suggesting there might be some common ground. But then she added that there are also moments when moral clarity does not require specialized expertise. She said that some issues are about basic human dignity rather than policy detail. Her tone remained composed, but her phrasing sharpened the philosophical divide once more. Malek responded calmly but firmly. He said he agrees that dignity and empathy are universal values. However, he stressed that expressing those values publicly must come from genuine reflection, not from the momentum of public pressure. He used the phrase intentional engagement, repeating it as if to underline its importance. At this point, the pacing slowed again. The conversation had moved from broad principles into more personal philosophy. Body language around the table remained controlled. Whoopi's posture was upright, her hands resting calmly in front of her. Malek's gestures were minimal, his focus steady. Another co-host attempted to broaden the lens by mentioning how the media environment amplifies every word spoken by public figures. She pointed out that sometimes even well-intentioned statements are taken out of context. That observation drew quiet agreement from both sides of the table. Malek seized on that point, explaining that context collapse is one of his main concerns. He described how nuanced discussions can be reduced to brief clips online. His tone was not defensive, but it carried a clear sense of caution. He said that when words are stripped of their full meaning, they can inadvertently fuel division rather than understanding. Whoopi acknowledged that reality but countered that avoiding speech entirely does not prevent distortion. She suggested that distortion is part of public life, and that navigating it is something visible figures inevitably face. There was no sharpness in her voice, but her point was clear. The audience offered a small round of applause at that moment, perhaps responding to the acknowledgement of complexity. It wasn't enthusiastic or partisan applause, but rather recognition of a valid perspective. Malek leaned slightly forward and addressed that directly. He said he does not believe in avoiding speech entirely. Instead, he explained that he chooses carefully when and how to speak. He mentioned participating in long-form interviews and supporting causes through structured initiatives rather than reactive commentary. The exchange remained thoughtful, but there was an undercurrent of firmness on both sides. Neither appeared frustrated, yet both were clearly committed to their viewpoint. Whoopi then shifted the focus slightly again by asking whether he believes that artists historically have underestimated their influence. She referenced how cultural figures have shaped conversations across decades. Her phrasing suggested that influence can sometimes be greater than artists themselves recognize. Malek considered the question carefully. He agreed that influence exists, but he reiterated that influence must be handled responsibly. He said he does not want to conflate visibility with expertise. His voice remained steady, but there was a subtle emphasis on the distinction between influence and authority. The conversation was no longer about a specific issue at all. It had evolved into a layered dialogue about philosophy, media, and personal boundaries. The audience appeared to sense that as well. There were fewer audible reactions now, more concentrated listening. At one point, a co-host lightly remarked that the fact they were able to have this conversation without shouting was itself meaningful. That comment drew a ripple of appreciative laughter, briefly easing the tension. Both Whoopi and Malek smiled at that observation. Still, the seriousness lingered. Whoopi concluded this portion of the exchange by saying that she values when guests are willing to engage in uncomfortable conversations. She clarified that disagreement is not disrespect. Her tone was steady, signaling a moment of mutual acknowledgement. Malek responded by saying he appreciated the space to articulate his perspective. He emphasized that open dialogue, even when it reveals differences, is preferable to silence driven by fear. That statement appeared to bridge part of the divide, even if their philosophies remained distinct. As the segment approached its final stretch, the energy in the studio felt measured and reflective. There had been no raised voices, no interruptions, no overt conflict. Yet the tension had been real, not explosive but philosophical. The conversation had unfolded the way serious daytime discussions sometimes do. Calm on the surface, layered underneath. The cameras remained steady, the audience attentive, and the table composed. What began as a promotional appearance had transformed into a thoughtful exchange about public responsibility, authenticity, and the complexities of speaking in a highly scrutinized world. And as the final portion of the segment approached, viewers at home could likely sense that the conversation would soon move toward resolution. Not necessarily agreement, but clarity about where each participant stood. As the segment moved into its final stretch, the tone at the table shifted once again, not toward resolution in the sense of agreement, but toward reflection. The energy was steady, and the earlier tension had settled into something more contemplative. It was clear that both Rami Malek and Whoopi Goldberg understood the conversation had traveled far beyond a typical promotional exchange. Whoopi leaned slightly forward and, in her role as moderator, began guiding the discussion toward a close. She acknowledged that the conversation had covered a lot of ground and noted that it's not often daytime television allows space for philosophical disagreement without interruption. Her tone was calm and appreciative, signaling that whatever differences had surfaced, they were part of a productive exchange rather than a personal conflict. Malek nodded in agreement. He reiterated that he values open dialogue and that his perspective is not rooted in avoidance but in intention. He clarified once more that he does speak out when he feels fully informed and personally aligned with the issue at hand. What he resists, he said, is speaking simply because silence has become controversial. Whoopi responded by summarizing her position in a measured way. She said that her belief in public engagement comes from decades of observing how influence shapes culture. She emphasized that she respects his thoughtfulness, but hopes that public figures remember the impact they can have during pivotal moments. There was no edge in her voice, only conviction. At that point, one of the co-hosts offered a brief comment about the importance of modeling respectful disagreement. She said that viewers benefit from seeing conversations where neither side retreats into defensiveness. That comment drew a gentle round of applause from the audience, which had remained engaged throughout the entire exchange. The audience reaction in the studio was notable. There had been no loud cheering or audible disapproval at any stage. Instead, the responses had been subtle, small nods, brief applause, thoughtful silence. It reflected the tone of the discussion itself, serious but controlled. As the segment wrapped, Whoopi thanked Malek for being willing to engage in a deeper conversation. She made it clear that disagreement at the table does not equate to hostility. Malek responded by thanking the panel for allowing space to express a nuanced viewpoint. His posture relaxed slightly, and the intensity that had characterized the middle portion of the segment softened. The cameras then briefly shifted back to a promotional mention of his project. It was a return to the original purpose of his appearance, but it felt almost secondary after the layered discussion that had unfolded. The audience applauded warmly as the segment closed, the applause slightly louder than earlier in the show, perhaps an acknowledgement of the thoughtful tone that had been maintained. Once the episode aired in full, reactions began to circulate online within hours. Viewers who watched live commented on the calm but firm exchange between Malek and Whoopi Goldberg. Many praised the absence of raised voices, noting that it was refreshing to see a disagreement handled without escalation. Others debated the substance of the discussion itself, with some siding with Whoopi's view that visibility carries responsibility, and others agreeing with Malek's emphasis on intentional engagement. Short clips of the exchange began circulating on social media platforms later that afternoon. As often happens, some excerpts were trimmed down to brief moments, particularly the portion where Whoopi mentioned that silence can sometimes leave a vacuum, and the part where Malek spoke about resisting performative statements. These clips sparked commentary threads, with users analyzing body language and tone. However, viewers who watched the full segment tended to describe the conversation as balanced rather than heated. Media commentators later that evening characterized it as a philosophical disagreement rather than a confrontation. The word heated appeared in some headlines, but those who had seen the entire discussion recognized that the tension was intellectual rather than emotional. In the days following the broadcast, neither Malek nor Whoopi issued statements framing the exchange as contentious. Instead, brief follow-up interviews referenced the discussion as an example of thoughtful dialogue. Malek reiterated in one interview that he appreciates platforms where he can articulate complex views without soundbite pressure. Whoopi, during a later episode, briefly referenced the conversation as proof that disagreement does not have to mean division. Inside the studio community, the segment was described as one of those moments when live television demonstrates its unique value. It was unscripted, measured, and layered. There were no dramatic walk-offs, no raised voices, no abrupt cut to commercial to manage tension. Instead, viewers witnessed a real-time exchange of differing philosophies about influence and responsibility. For many watching at home, the most striking element was not the disagreement itself, but the tone. It was the calm insistence on both sides. Malek did not retreat from his position, and Whoopi did not soften hers. Yet both remained respectful, listening carefully before responding. By the end of the episode, the atmosphere had returned to its usual rhythm. The panel transitioned to the next topic, and the show moved forward. But the earlier conversation lingered in the minds of viewers. It was the kind of segment that prompts reflection rather than immediate reaction. What had started as a routine daytime appearance had gradually evolved into a substantive exchange about public voice, authenticity, and expectation in a media-driven culture. There was no dramatic climax, no decisive winner. Instead, there was clarity about where each participant stood. And perhaps that was the most meaningful outcome, not agreement, but understanding. If you watched the segment, you likely formed your own opinion about whether public figures should speak immediately in moments of social tension, or whether thoughtful restraint carries equal value. Conversations like this often leave room for multiple interpretations. Share your opinion in the comments and subscribe to Prime Voice for more narration-based talk show stories.